Thank you very much for having me. What I hope to do today is to persuade you that this is actually an extremely exciting time to work in the development sector, in the humanitarian sector. And this is because I think this is the era of development mutants. So I'll try to persuade you why this is a nice thing, nothing to be scared of, and then we can have a discussion whether you think this is actually, you agree with my hypothesis or not. So I call the era of development mutants because I think this is an era where we see that the traditional monopoly in the development sector is being broken up. There's many new entrants into this sector. There are social enterprises that are making look many NGOs incredibly slow. There's private sector companies that are entering into what used to be the territory of development organizations. And there's, in general, many new players that are entering this space, which are making the sector quite difficult to recognize at times. Now, the general reaction of many development organizations that I'm working with to the entrant of the mutants has been similar to the reaction of the Europeans when this first animal was brought to Europe. So first test for you, what animal is this? Platypus. A platypus, yes. Do you know what happened when the first platypus was brought to Europe, the first specimen? Yeah, it was skinned already in Australia, thankfully. That's right. So it was officially recorded as a Chinese hoax. They said it's impossible that an animal like this exists. It's just different parts of different animals stitched together. This is not a real animal. Now, I think that many development organizations are in a similar state of denial about the change that is happening around them. So I don't know about you, but I work in and out of the development sector for the last 15 years, and I often encounter many different types of speeds. So I like to quote this from Jack Welch, and I'm sorry for those of you at the back, this will look a bit like an optician test. But it says, if the rate of change on the outside is greater than the change on the inside, then the end is near. And I often find that I walk into meetings with the private sector, but increasingly even with governments. And the speed is quite different from the speed that I find inside the development sectors. I'm going to show you some examples. And again, apologies, this will look quite small on the screen for you. So let's see if anybody can recognize this. I'm very curious. Has anybody done any of this? Yes, it's the infamous P11 of a UN system, if you want to get a job at the UN. Now, this is clearly a piece of antiquariat. Yeah? This was designed in the 60s, never changed ever since. It is not meant for human consumption. Why would they ask you for your height and weight in your job application is still beyond me, all right? So compare this with the speed of a private sector. This is how a startup hires its staff today. Has anybody seen the handbook from Valve? It's a startup. This is from their official handbook to new staff. There is a chapter which is called Welcome to Flatland. This is our organizational chart. This is everybody, and Gabe, who happens to be your boss. But actually, Gabe is not really your boss, because this company is yours to steer. You have a power to greenlight projects. You have a power to ship products. Now, when is the last time that your boss told you things like this? No, don't need to answer. The point about this, so who do you think is going to hire the smartest minds these days? The millennials. Oops. Ooh, what happened? Oops. Sorry. People who hire like this, or people who hire like this? Two different speeds. I'll give you another example. Who here thinks that procurement is a source of innovation? I don't see many hands raised up. Some people do, yes. Well, I'm often working with a number of different organizations that are, claiming that they are, moving to a new level of procurement, etc. And I always said, this is all very well, but are you considering that maybe procurement itself is a problem? So I don't know if any of you has worked with CityMart or heard of CityMart. Yes? So CityMart is an organization that is working with around 50 cities around the world. And what we are saying is starting under the premise that fundamentally the way traditional procurement is done is the problem that stifles much of innovation. So in traditional procurement, you define the problem, and you define the solution, and then you say who has the solution to this problem. What CityMart is saying to municipalities, you know what, these days you're way too slow to know what really the solutions are, and you don't know where the solution can come from. So why don't you just stop at defining the problem, and then let the solution come, regardless of which approach we use, whoever presents it, etc. Different type of speed. I don't know if you have been involved in the data revolutions discussions. Another example of two different speeds. So much of it, in my experience so far, has been framed around building the capacity of national statistical offices or doing more household surveys, for example. Now, this is obviously fantastic, and it is needed. But at the same time, as you have this discussion in the development sector, you have startups like Premise. Has any of you worked with them? No? OK. So Premise is a startup that was designed under the assumption that national statistical offices are basically a thing of the past. Premise has proven with its methodology, which is recruitment of volunteers that take pictures in, for example, food markets in very rural areas, in emerging markets. And then this picture is analyzed through an algorithm. The person who collects the data verifies that the solution is right and basically provides food prices. Premise has proven to be 25 days faster than the National Statistical Office in Brazil in gathering food prices. I did a small project with them in Indonesia, and indeed we were able to get, within a very short period of time, geolocated data, real time, and validated by people on the ground. If I were to ask you how would you find how many people in Geneva are obese, how would you go about it? Google? What else? Go to supermarkets? What else? McDonald's? What kind of data would you want to have?
Workplace and schools.
Yeah, workplace and schools. Yeah, maybe fitness, things like that, right? So this is a project, I don't know if any of you saw the MIT Underworld, and I'm sorry this is not very good to discuss after breakfast. But this is a project of the MIT that's launched recently in Kuwait, and what we're doing is real-time monitoring of sewage. Why? Because obesity is associated with certain type of bacteria, and they claim that by picking up this, they can actually do reasonable projections about the level of obesity in a city. Think about how this is different from the way that traditionally one would go about collecting this type of data. Now, this is still experimental. You need to ask lots of questions about these experiments. But the point about this is that you can see the beginning of radically different approaches to solving these problems. Another example, if you wanted to measure real time the economy in a particular location, how would you go about it? This has been very elusive. Measuring the economy in general is extremely complicated, right, as we know. This is an example from Planet Labs, which is a nano-satellite company. And what they have done in this particular case, they wanted to see whether they can monitor the production of factories as a proxy indicator of economic output in a particular location. What they do is they take these pictures and they analyze the level of smoke and things like the movement of cars around the factories to make an estimate of how much that factory is actually being used or underused, and make assumptions about the production of the economy there. Has anybody heard of Project Sunroof from Google? No? So Google has this project in the US, which is basically, they realized by analyzing searches that lots of people who wanted to install solar panels are actually finding the whole process very difficult to understand whether it's worthwhile or not to install solar panels. And I know from many projects in development organizations, typically you hire consultants who do assessments and all sorts of type of things to get this type of assessment done. And what they do is you Google in your postcode, and based on data that they get from Google Earth, they make an estimate of how much sun your roof gets. And based on that, they give you an idea whether it's worthwhile for you to install a solar panel or not. Again, a very different way of thinking about the same issues. So Sean told me that you're having a meeting about Zika virus. So I just wanted to flag this. If you haven't seen it, UNICEF has just announced a partnership with Google today, looking at ways in which they're gathering data. So this is searches, visualizing searches for Zika virus over time. If you Google it, you can find the actual data behind it. More example of different speeds. Has any of you heard of BitNation? BitNation, you can look at them as either visionaries or completely lunatics. It's your call. But it's basically a startup that is started under the assumption, why should you be limited to pick only one passport in your life? Can't you actually, if you don't like the way that your country does birth registration, get birth registration as a service from some other country? Now, this is all quite interesting or intriguing, at least to me. Perfect example of a platypus. But then when you get to real life problems, so for example, registrations of refugees. So I was in Macedonia recently, and it is incredibly difficult to keep track of refugee flows, as you know. National Statistical Office can hardly cope with internal migration, let alone international migration. So what these guys have done is proving an experiment that you can do registration as a service, legal registration of refugees online. Now, if you think still this is quite experimental, which it is, has any of you heard of Estonia e-residency program? Today, you can, from your computer, become an e-resident of Estonia and establish a business legally in Estonia for around 25 euros. Now, why I think this is interesting, again, platypuses and different speeds, is that the development sector is struggling with many transnational issues, right? Whether it is migration, climate change, etc. Do solutions like this point to a potential future of transnational solutions for the development sector? Maybe, maybe not. Final set of examples. This is on disaster response. So I worked in Jakarta, and I came across this startup called FloodTags. What you can see here is the level of water in Jakarta, the actual level of the water. And on top, you can see the level of the water as predicted by analyzing tweets. Why? Because Jakarta is the #1 city in the world for Twitter usage. And there's enough people who go on Twitter and say, oh my God, there are 2 meters of water in front of my house, or in my house, etc. You can pick up sufficient digital signal that you can actually do a reasonably accurate model for prediction of floods. Now, this in itself is interesting, but what I find more interesting is the business model of FloodTags, a perfect platypus. These guys they under the assumption that no municipality in the world will pay for their services. Okay, so they give this thing as a freemium to municipalities, and they say, so how do they do their money? Through the data analytics. So they are in 21 different countries, and they claim that they are one of the biggest providers of data floods around the world. You can go to their website and download some of this if you're interested. Obviously, you have some other interesting things happening. You probably know better than me about this, right? So Airbnb, for instance, has official disaster management program now. Again, an example of a private sector entering what used to be typically development or NGO sector work, right? And they have a program where they offer beds in case of disaster, and they also train people on what to do in case of emergencies. And then you have more experimental examples, like in China, where you have these examples to create sponge cities to absorb the water. Financing. Another area where you can see an awful lot of experimentation at the moment, partially due to the fact that many financing for development organization is not going very well. So you can see a whole new set of tools being experimented with. Traditionally, the development sector was doing loans, grants, and if you are really experimental, you were doing some microfinance. Now there is an awful lot of new tools being opened up. The most obvious one is crowdfunding. This is an example from Pakistan. This is a platform that crowdfunds surgery for extremely poor people, emergency surgery that don't have otherwise possibility to affording it. Has anybody worked with Give Directly? Yeah? So Give Directly is basically trying to revolutionize cash transfers to poor people. And part of what makes their model interesting is actually how they determine who is poor in a particular location. They have a number of very interesting experiments, starting from looking at the composition of a roof through satellite data to see what is the roof like in a particular village, and assuming that the better the roof, the higher the income of a family living under it, to more on-the-ground type of experiments to determine who is poor and who is not. Has any of you heard of Sardex? This is my national Italian flag coming up. Sardex is, to me, one of the most interesting experiments in Europe, possibly in the world, around the use of alternative currencies. So this is created by 4 experts who had an arts and humanities background and were so depressed by the situation in Sardinia, which is one of the lowest developed regions in Italy, where lots of people were migrating because of that. And they said, can we do anything about this? So they established this effectively mutual credit scheme. So if I am a small business holder, and I need 200 euros to keep my barber shop open, for example, I can actually lend Sardex from another person, right? And this is becoming an official currency now in Sardinia that is expanding across a number of different regions in Europe, in Italy, and then starting to go also in Europe. If you're in Kenya, you can buy government bonds, infrastructure bonds through your mobile phone, opening up a whole new class of assets for people who are unbanked, and so forth and so on. So the general feeling about all of this is that working across a number of development organizations, what I pick up is that increasingly there's a feeling that the set of tools that their development organizations are using is not fit for purpose. Whether you're still recruiting using a P11, whether you're still doing procurement, doing RFPs, whether you're still trying to calculate statistics, doing the traditional surveys, these tools are not not really up for scratch. And when you use the wrong tool for the job, you end up in a situation like this. So many of the organizations I talk to feel very much on this curve. This is the bad curve, okay? The curve of decline. On the other hand, you have the mutants that feel very much that they are picking up and entering a new territory and growing. And at the moment, we are just in this very interesting period, and this is why I think it's a very fascinating place to be now, where the smaller players have still not reached the scale to really threaten the traditional players, but still there's lots of bubbling experimentation going up, and there is still quite a lot of innovation in traditional development players. So I call this the era of the mutants, and I think it's actually very interesting to watch what's happening next. If you wanted to look at a more serious analysis of this, you might want to look at ODI, produced this Horizon 2025 study. They did an equivalent of a financial test for banks to development organizations and do a stress test and say, how fit are you and your processes to the challenges that we foresee for the next 20 years for the development sector? And this is the ranking that they came up with. I would also encourage you to take a look at Oxfam paper on Fit for the Future, which I find very interesting reading. So back to the platypuses. As I said, my experience is that many organizations are quite scared. So I wanted to talk about what one can do if you actually want to embrace the platypuses rather than being scared by them. So the first principle I want to offer is a very obvious one, but in my experience, unfortunately neglected, which is mapping assets and not needs. So many people, I work on innovation, and they come to me and say, what do you mean by innovation? What is innovative, etc.? And so I actually say there is actually 1 second test that you can do to know immediately whether you are in the innovation space or not, which is if you're designing projects starting from a place that looks like this, you're already not in the innovation space. So if you want your elevator pitch, this is it. Because once you design projects from a place that looks like that, and then you go to the real world and the field, then your immediate attitude is to say either, oh, what do you need? Right? What can I do for you? Or whatever new idea can I bring to this place? And I think this is a recipe for disaster. Has any of you read the World Bank Development Report last year? If you haven't, I would encourage you to look at the chapter on the cognitive biases of development workers. And being one of them, I can tell you that all the biases apply to me. They did a very interesting piece it's on behavioral science. They did an interesting piece comparing the perception of World Bank staff in plushy, comfortable offices, what they thought of poor people, and what poor people thought of themselves. And the results are actually quite very interesting. So I encourage you to take a look in terms of what they thought the sense of agency of poor people were. So if you design projects thinking that poor people are actually the experts on poverty, that the person who takes a bus every day is the transport expert, as the mayor of Calgary likes to say, you come up with very different project type of design. So has anybody seen this, the Stop Poverty from Fundación Paraguaya? No? So this is an experiment that started in Paraguay and said, you know what, the way we usually do household surveys to find out who's poor is to send someone to say, oh, you know, do a questionnaire, et cetera, et cetera. What if we ask poor people and we provide them with the tool to measure by themselves how poor they are and what they can do about it? And so they provide visual representations of what poverty is in a particular community as defined by the family themselves. This has already scaled to a number of different countries and give a sense of action of what they can do about it. One of my favorite examples of this is a project that was with the Bushmen in Namibia. And so once again, a clever initial design of a project was we come in with drones and we replace all the rangers because we can do wildlife monitoring using the drones. But before they did that, they did a test and say who would be better to pick up. They knew there was a rhino in a particular location. And said who would be faster to find the rhino, the drone or the bushman? And the assumption was, oh well, you know, yeah, okay, poor bushman, you know, whatever, right? So by the time they stood up the drone, the bushmen had already come back and were having tea, having identified the rhino. More importantly, when they get them to see pictures like this is what the drone sees. What the bushmen see is 3 different species. Not only that, they can name the name of the actual rhino because they know from the type of shade that the animal has on the ground, they can tell you what animal is that. So the project was redesigned completely to actually tap into the local expertise so that these are actually the guys who analyze the drone images. Right? If you work at the National Innovation Foundation in India, you have in your contract a stipulation that says every 6 months you know to go out to rural areas and observe local innovations. Document local innovations done by people. And then they have a whole series of financial instruments to scale up these innovations, which would make any development organizations that I know of pale in comparison. You can design projects really quite differently if you start under the assumption that people who have a problem are actually the highest incentive in solving it. This is one of my favorite ones. It's called patient innovation. And this was started under the assumption that the people who have the highest incentive to cure a disease is the patient who suffers from it. Seems quite logic, right? But nobody had done it before. So what they have done is they went out and found examples of people who found a solution to their own disease. This particular guy had a very particular lung condition. He had to go to the doctor almost every day to get a special type of treatment. One day, this guy goes to the opera. He realizes that the vibration he gets from the music is comparable to the treatment that he gets at the hospital. He hacks an amplifier, and now he gets his cure at home. This guy has no incentive to spread his innovation. He solved his own problem, right? But what if you were asking him, how do we get more like you? What if the first step that you do when you start a project is to actually find out who has already solved that particular problem in a particular location? A favorite example of mine is in Sao Paulo these days, where citizens are running classes for public servants on how to run public services. I'll just show you another final example. This is a project called Infrastructures. It's in Manila. And it started under the assumption that people continuously hack and innovate on the electrical grid. Any of you who's been to a developing country knows this extremely well, right? So what they said is, well, technically speaking, these things are illegal, right? Or they're not part of the system. What they say, what if we start documenting this and see what level of innovation this actually generates? So lo and behold, we find all sorts of interesting approaches to do street lighting, which are completely invisible from the point of view of a central planner. In fact, from the point of view of a central planner, this is a nuisance, right? So what if you actually take this as the natural level of innovation that is distributed in the population, and you start building projects around it? I'll give you very quickly 4 more principles that I think are quite important from my point of view. One of them is, if you want to embrace the platypuses, be prepared for multiple different futures. Again, an example, I worked quite a lot with women empowerment NGOs in Indonesia, and many of them were traditionally focused on an activity like basket weaving, for example, which is obviously very needed and appropriate. But I asked them, you know, is there really no other possibility of thinking of a future for women in Indonesia which is not basket weaving? So we did a little bit of research, And lo and behold, we found this group. So this is a collective of biohackers, all female, who have figured out a way to hack the DNA of bacteria so that they turn the waste from tofu into textiles. These ladies have already 3 rounds of venture capital from different parts of the world. They won a fairly prestigious award, which is a Prisa Electronica prize. These people don't want to be engaged the way the traditionally development organizations think about youth engagement, for example, right? They solve their own problems. They're running a fairly successful activity. How do you actually get a traditional development organization to acknowledge that this is not obviously the solution to all problems in the world, but it is one of the many possible different futures for women in this particular location? Another example, if I asked you where would you go to look for the future of healthcare, which country would you pick?
This one.
Well, most people tell me Singapore or something like that, etc. Right? So this is a project called Open Care that said, why don't we go to Greece? And lo and behold, when you go to Greece, which probably you would have thought is the last place you go to for innovation on health service, they mapped out this all parallel informal health sector that has homegrown 46 pop-up clinics all across Greece. By their estimate, at least one of them has done 2,000 interventions in the last year alone. And this system exists completely in parallel, informal, all on a volunteer basis. They don't accept money. They run basically a parallel health system. Does this mean that this is the solution to a problem of Greece? No. But does this mean that this is possible different future for the health sector? Maybe yes. So at Nesta, we spend quite a lot of time thinking about how we think about the future. And this, you probably have seen this many times before, but this is a traditional way in which you try to think about future when you think of a future as plurals, not as singular, right? So most of planning, and in my experience, much development planning is done around probable futures. So you project from what is happening now and try to extrapolate what might happen in the future. If you actually take into account multiple futures, you look into possible future, probable futures, plausible futures, and preferable futures, right? So you expand your cone and say, you know what? Biohackers, collective of biohackers is a future which is probably not very probable, but certainly it's possible. Why are we not prepared for it, and why don't we actually engage with it? You know this sentence probably many times over. You've seen it. So I'll give you an example. In Dubai, the government every year does the Museum of Future Government Services. Why do they do this? Because they think that actually running training is not necessarily the best way to build mental agility of public servants to think about many possible different futures. So we actually get them to experience what the future of services look like. So this is, for example, a future where the public servant goes to deliver the services through a driverless car to the person who needs it, as opposed to a person coming to a municipality or something like that. People experience it and get a sense of what actually this would look like so that they can actually start thinking what a potential different future could be. Another principle I want to touch briefly upon is the death of linear solutions. Has anybody encountered a situation like this? So think to the plan to the right as your project document, and think of the reality of what happens on the left, right? Why does this happen? Let me ask you a quiz. How many of you think that the refugee crisis can be solved through a mobile app? Yes, no, maybe, part of, somewhat, etc., right? I think that it can be solved also through a mobile app, but certainly not only through a mobile app, right? But yet, you see oftentimes these terrible headlines that say, you know what, refugee crisis, there's an app for that, or things like this, right? These simple linear solutions to what are incredibly complex problems. Can anybody know what this is? Star Trek? Enterprise? Any other guess? No? Okay. Television station.
The radio station, rather.
Radio station, okay. All extremely good guesses. This is a control room that was built in 1972 for Salvador Allende. the president of Chile, who actually invited a scientist to come and build for him a control room for which he could control the economy of a country real time. Does this sound familiar? I don't know about you, but most of the governments and other organizations that I work with have a dashboard syndrome. So every problem looks like a dashboard. Give me real-time data on maternal mortality, I'll solve maternal mortality, yeah? That type of linear things. This is, to me, exemplifies that type of attitude. So I unfortunately have to review a number of proposals for innovation funds and all sorts of other things in the development sector. And I find over and over again this type of patterns. This thinking that if only you have data, then people act on it. If only we do an awareness-raising campaign, all of a sudden people will take action on this particular topic. Right? If we build a mobile app, no more corruption. Right? This happens over and over again. So, this is just an interesting example for me. This is a study that just came up from the World Bank looking at how much of these reporting apps have actually had an impact on the behavior of government. Surprisingly enough, not too many. Why is that? Can anybody recognize this? Yes, at least one person. When the US Army was asked to do a press conference on why the war in Afghanistan was not going as planned, a general famously had the brilliant idea of presenting this to the journalist and saying, you know what, it's a bit more complicated than what we thought. And I think this unfortunately happens with when these many linear solutions meet the reality. Reality on the ground is complex, there's many interchanging players, and reducing this to linear solutions just doesn't work. Not only that, but oftentimes the most obvious and linear solution is not the best one to tackle a particular problem, right? Just because you have a corruption problem, it doesn't mean that an anti-corruption campaign is the best way to go about it. I'll give you one example. As you probably know, there is a terrible haze problem in Southeast Asia, right? So in Indonesia, for example, illegal logging and forest fires are causing mayhem and creating situations like this. Now, if we sit in a room like this with policy planner, we do a workshop and a brainstorming session and say, what do we do about illegal logging and deforestation? What would you say? Or forest fires, what would you say? Advocacy, campaign, yeah, you go in automatic mode, right? Yes, capacity building, right? Yeah? Yes? Okay. Empowering, yeah, fantastic. Okay, you have buzzwords ready, right? So what this particular group did is they realized that probably their best chance to get any action is to get the citizens of Singapore to sue their own government to solve the Indonesian problem. Why? Because the haze goes all the way to Singapore. They made a case against the government to say, actually, this is an environmental hazard for us in Singapore. You take action against the Indonesians and put pressure on them. Right? This is the example of a non-linear, non-obvious solution to this particular problem. Right? It hasn't solved it, of course, but look into it. Another favorite example of mine is a project from the RSA. This is in the UK. But just to give you an example, so these guys said, okay, why do we want to reduce we actually want to build social capital in communities and do a number of projects like urban gardening, all sorts of other things like this. Now, the result of this is that the use of hospitals in particular locations went down dramatically. Now, if I put you in a room like this and I ask you, how do you reduce the use of hospitals? You, again, probably go into a certain type of solutions. Why did they actually succeed by building social capital? Because when they did the analysis, they figured out that many people go to a doctor not because they want to see the doctor, but because they want to talk to someone. Now, this seems logical enough, yeah, when you think about it. But if you actually put in a room people and start thinking, how do you reduce health problems, health sector problems, probably they don't come up with a solution like this. So the solution they adopted was social prescriptions. So you go to the doctor, instead of getting, before you see the doctor, instead of getting medical prescription, you actually say, go and talk to 5 people. Right? And they have some interesting results to look into this. Another obvious thing that I want to emphasize, if you want to embrace Platons, it seems strange, but projects are not the natural unit of development. And in my experience, unfortunately, much of the development work is so projectized that you lose track of this. So I actually think that looking at the bigger picture is often how many different interventions are connected to each other, even in the context of a project, can actually lead to very different type of solution. So thinking about systems as opposed to program or project intervention can lead to different type of solutions. I'll give you an example. I just came across this last week. It was a fantastic interviews between Kolkas, the architect, and another Nigerian architect that wanted to actually work in Lagos and figure out what do we do as innovative intervention in Lagos. Now, the first thing that they did is something which I would bet many development organizations have never done. They took an helicopter and they started going above Lagos to see patterns in the chaos. They wanted to see the system first before doing the granular intervention on the ground. Things like this. So this is a tomato market where there is not a single instruction on the ground, and yet people self-organize fairly effectively. This is a complex system, right, where people self-organize as an emerging property of what is happening. So they said, okay, once you understand that the city actually finds a way to operate with unofficial instructions, can you actually think of different interventions once you understand how the system operates? And they came up with solutions like this. You've probably seen this. This is an award-winning project. It's a floating school just outside Lagos. Other examples, when you look at the solutions from a system perspective, is one of a favorite of mine. In Indonesia, there is something called the waste banks, where they wanted to encourage people to recycle. And what they looked at it is from a systemic perspective, say what actually would encourage people to do this. And what happens is that you actually, when you bring back your stuff to be recycled, you get paid in health insurance. Connecting two services that were not connected before to come up with a different type of solution altogether. Final point I want to make is this. If you think about many of your projects, a theory of change is really ultimately just an hypothesis of change. In fact, most of the development projects are basically hypotheses that need to be tested. The problem is that when you run it through a bureaucracy and you turn it into a log frame, what logically is an hypothesis turns into the Bible and the truth. So it's not if I do a training, then people might change their behavior. It's I'm going to deliver the training by September 2015, and then people will do this, right? You turn something which is an hypothesis to be tested into a linear narrative of something that is going to happen for sure. And this is where many of the problems arise. So what can you do to counteract this? I think that the idea of multiple parallel experiments is a way when you are intervening in a very complex system to understand what actually are your entry points. You probably are familiar with this. It's a fairly famous case. If you want to encourage people to reduce the use of energy, what do you do? What kind of campaign do you run? If you sit in this room and you think about the most logical options, you probably do the first three things that are on the left. This is an actual campaign. It was done in the States. And say, you know, if you use less energy and you save money, use less energy and you save a planet, appealing to your greater good, be a good citizen. Impact on behavior, The campaign that was actually most successful was putting in the electricity bill something of a tune of, did you know your neighbor on average consumes 20% less than you do? This you only find out if you run multiple parallel experiments. You try to test the non-lobbyous, non-linear solutions and see if they have more inroads than the ones that you would try otherwise, right? Another favorite experiment of this in Indonesia wanted to reduce corruption, and they tried some of the most obvious interventions, which were things like, what happens is that basically the rice subsidies somehow disappear on the way from the capital to the communities that were supposed to get it, right? So there's quite a lot of corruption. So I wanted to test different interventions to do it. From training, from informing people of their rights, which had an impact. But one of the most impactful one was actually putting boards in the center of villages saying who was entitled to the subsidies. And having a loudspeaker on the mosque every day reminding people of who was entitled to get their subsidies. That generated a sense of people taking action and actually starting to ask for their subsidies. So I just want to leave you with this final thought, or let me get back to this for a second. So I talked about mapping assets and not needs, being ready for multiple futures, the depth of linear solutions, moving from projects to ecosystems, and running multiple parallel experiments. The final thing that I want to leave you with is that I think many development organizations don't do enough, is investing in the implausible. I was at an exhibition in Tokyo last year, I think, where a brief was given to a number of design companies to design a water bottle for an era of water scarcity, for the Anthropocene. And so these guys said, you know what, this is interesting, but it's actually not challenging enough. What we think we actually need to do is to redesign the human body. So they spent 1 year studying desert rats and figuring out all the body functions that I won't get into that basically allow them to reduce the consumption of water. And then they designed implants that you would put in different parts of the body, again, I don't go in the details, to actually redesign the human body for the era of the Anthropocene. Now, thankfully, I think none of this was actually used in any human being, but the point about it is that this type of radical rethinking of problems that I think is not done enough in the development sector. And I think this is actually what would help us a lot embrace the mutants. So if I have persuaded you, when the next time you see a platypus, actually embrace it. Don't be scared. And I'm very happy to take questions, discussions, strong reactions against it. Thank you very much.
Questions?
You need to use microphone.
Actually, thank you. First of all, it was actually really interesting. I think it touches a lot of sensitive points for all of us. What do you think? What could be the first step for moving from projects to ecosystems in an organization like ours? I mean, we need to start thinking about where we are.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, everything looks really enticing. But then how do we start?
Yep. So, based on experience, because actually this is what I do most of the time with organizations I work with, right? So I like to think that one very simple step to do is to map the system around you. And regardless quite actually where you live, just as a mental exercise, right? So for instance, how often do you have breakfasts with the local innovators in Geneva, right? Very simple steps, right? But ideally, what you would do if you are actually closer to where the problems are is sending people to actually map what are the assets in particular location, right? And when you get that level of granular understanding of what is happening, this is when you start thinking about non-linear, non-obvious solutions, right? So when I was working on maternal mortality in Indonesia, one of the first things that we did is we sent some of the young staff to actually map all the local innovation ecosystem in Indonesia. And lo and behold, in a country of 300 million people, level of innovation is extraordinary, right? And just having a sense of what is already happening, the future that is already here, builds a lot of mental agility, right? Because it challenges some of your perception of what is possible and what is not possible, just by saying, oh, this is actually happening. So, you might not like it, but it's happening. So at least you are aware of that. And then once you start doing that, you get to a much granular understanding of what are the dynamics on the ground. This, to me, is essential, right? A precondition and very simple step. So imagine training 5 people in a particular location that go out and start mapping interesting things that are happening and understanding with a certain eye on a particular problem, what are the issues around it and how are they connected. And then, of course, this is just a warm-up exercise, but it's already builds your, I like to say at Nesta that innovation is better, people think about the light bulb. It's much better to think about it as a muscle that you exercise. So, there's a number of things that you can do to exercise that muscles. To me, starting by mapping around you, what are some of the interesting things that are happening is a very simple first step to actually move into that system type of thinking.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Giulio, for that presentation. I think mine is just for your advice, because we know in low-income countries, especially in villages, we have young people who are very innovative. And you talked about mapping local innovations.
Yeah.
Now, how do we get big companies to actually invest or tap in that knowledge? Because in villages, people are doing amazing things, but what they need is recognition and probably these big companies to invest in their talent.
I don't know if someone tipped you, but this is one of my favorite questions ever. Okay, so I actually have this construct which I mediated from a professor at Harvard that says there's something that are called the non-contractibles. So most bureaucracies have a problem of non-contractibles, right? So these are people that you cannot contract. First of all, because you don't know that they exist. Like your young kids, probably many corporations don't even know that they exist. Secondly, even if you know that they exist, you don't know where they are, how good they are. Most importantly, many of them probably don't want to work for you because you are too boring, too slow, whatever else. They are actually much faster than you are. So how do you find a way to engage with the non-contractibles in a way that you actually have a meaningful relation with them, right? So we at Nesta, we just produced a report on how big corporates can actually relate with startups, which is a variation of what you're saying, right? I actually think that if you can find different ways to create interfaces between the rigid, big bureaucratic world of corporations, multinationals, frankly, development organizations in many places, and these non-contractibles, this is actually where you can find lots of room for experimentation. I find that oftentimes it's a matter of cultural attitude first, right? So again, many times people go to these villages and say, okay, what can we help you with? As opposed to say, where are the young kids that are really doing incredible stuff? Even if you want to do something with it, the system is designed not to engage with them. So for instance, procurement here becomes a real barrier. It's often very difficult, in my experience, for many big organizations to hire your individual who's not an NGO, who's not an SME, it's just simply someone who's doing some really cool stuff, great stuff, but is not formally anything. Yeah? And so this is where you start looking at ways in which you can actually engage with them. The final point about this is if you want to attract interesting people, you need to be interesting in the first place. Now, when is the last time that your boss asked you to be interesting? And I'm being facetious, but I actually think this is one of the big problems. It's back to the P11, right? If you actually want to engage some of the young innovators, you need to be able to attract them because what you present to them is interesting enough that they want to get engaged. I think that this is often a very, very big barrier because typically the interface between these innovators and big corporates or development organizations is something that looks like the P11 or some other type of formal workshop or whatever it is, right? It's just not designed for them. So I actually think this is perfectly the area where there is an awful lot of room for innovation. If you want to look at an interesting example of this happening, I would encourage you to look at Edge Riders, which is a social enterprise that actually specializes exactly in the process that you're saying. An interface between corporates and development sector and young innovators in very unsuspected places.
Thank you. Hello. I am Senior Officer Innovation in Cash Transfer Programming Team.
Okay.
And I'd like to thank you for two reasons. One, for saying that drones aren't the answer, because I swear I've had to argue that for a number of times. But the second point is your point around procurement and logistics, and I'm absolutely having this problem at the moment. So we're trying to come up with solutions for last mile delivery of cash. There are a lot of systems out there, new systems, and I just want to try and test some. I have an hypothesis. I don't know exactly what the requirements are, and yet I have to go and get 3 quotes. I'm writing the scope of work at the moment. But I'm just one person, and this is an organisational change. So how do we change? Because I keep being told, well, we have procurement process, the donors say this is what we have to do, we have to stick to it. What's your recommendation?
It's really bad that this is recorded. Just joking. So there's 2 or 3 different ways to look at this, right? So first of all, again, sorry, it seems like we primed the question, but actually at the beginning of the year, I wrote a blog post that said that I actually think that the innovation in the development sector for this year and next one should only be about the back office. Yeah? most development organizations are looking at flashy hubs, program level type of things, where actually, if you really want to break the system apart and open up opportunities, you look at HR, financing, procurement, and boring stuff. You're back, okay? This is generally speaking. Now, what to do about it? I can see two different things to go about it, right? So you can either, what I often say is, think about the root of a tree, right? This is an innovator. You look for the cracks. You look for the cracks, and then you crack the system open, okay? So when I was at UNDP, I did the first challenge based on the principle that we don't define the solution. Now, this was against the procurement rules. The way I got away with it is that I managed to find a crack in the system to actually say, you know what, there is one way in which you can get some sort of waiver to try it once. We see how this actually works. And then let's see how this actually happens. So I found my own crack. Now, you're not always lucky to find your own crack. The other way that you can do it is circumvent procurement altogether. So it goes back to being interesting. No, I'm not suggesting anything illegal. So can you make your project so interesting that people want to work on a prototype for you for free? So at the moment, I'm working with a number of organizations on this principle. So all the new areas that are so flashy that everybody wants to talk about it, right? Whether it is blockchain or drones or robotics, you name it, okay? I think there is an awful lot to be said about, are you able to present your project so interesting that actually people want to work at the prototype level for you for free. So this is the hacker way. The final thing, you can also game the system in the sense that, can you find someone who's interested actually in setting up a procurement lab? Not sexy, not flashy, not etc., but arguably one of the places where you can get a much, much more systemic level of innovation across the organization. Could you actually pitch something like that? And I think that that is something worth trying. I think that increasingly there will be people who have an interest in that.
Thank you. I have a question on the donor factor.
Yeah.
It was mentioned earlier, this donors are pushing systems or pushing organizations to be linear, to be projects. I'm curious to what extent you've had interactions with which donor, I mean, not naming donors, but are there donors who are starting to see the world in a slightly different way and are able to put funding, which is much more high risk? Because, of course, a lot of things, you've given a lot of examples of things that have worked and succeeded, and there's a lot of failures as well. Huh? So where's the donor? My second question is around knowledge sharing. A lot of what you're talking about is knowing who's doing what, where, and making those contacts, right? To what extent, but at the same time, I hear a lot of organizations putting a lot of emphasis on knowledge sharing and wanting knowledge sharing systems, maybe very, in a very linear thinking, perhaps, which we could be a victim of as well. But there's a constant feeling of failure around knowledge sharing. It's not working. People are not getting to know about what they want to hear or what they want to know of good practices someplace else, et cetera. So I'm curious on both those points. What have been your experiences and where should organizations be going?
Okay, so on the first one, well, first of all, I don't know what is your experience, but my experience is that there's no donors, like there is no government, right? So there is individuals inside donor organizations. So as usual, if you want to try the experimentation, is to find the people who are willing to support it. Now, having said that, there's lots of donors that are making noises in this direction, right? Talking about experimentation, talking about some money for new ways of funding that would allow for something like this. In a sense, what the Red Cross is doing, forecast-based financing, is an experiment of that type, right? So there are donors who are willing to do this, but again, it's difficult to generalize because at the end of the day, it boils down to situations, projects, and the people involved in that. But I would say that in some places, there is definitely more and more openness for some of this. I also say that from experience, having negotiated some very difficult donor agreements around experimentation, that this requires quite a lot. Oftentimes, I find that many NGOs and development organizations don't even try because they assume that on the other side there is no interest. And actually, in my experience, it takes a lot of back and forth, and it's a reciprocal education process, right? You understand where the constraints are on the other side, etc. But it's not an impossible dialogue sometimes, right? But I find that many times people don't even try to have a dialogue. But I would say that generally speaking, you find more and more reception, at least to the rhetoric of this, That doesn't necessarily translate into action many times, but there are certainly pockets where you can look at this, and donors that are making the right noises in the right direction. On the second one, okay, so let me say another thing which you didn't mention explicitly, but you said twice the word failure. I have a big issue with failure porn and all the innovation unit that says we need to create a culture where it's okay to fail. I actually don't think that this is the way I would think about this. And it's not a matter of rhetoric, it's actually conceptually, right? So if you remember, I showed this slide that says amateurs have great ideas and real innovators have hypotheses to be tested. If you take that literally, so when you are in a lab and you do experiments, you don't talk about failure. You take that the experiment had this result, which either confirmed our hypothesis or not. I know it's a nuance, but I actually think if you really embrace the experimentation really, and not just by saying, oh, it's okay, right? You don't talk about failure. You talk about experiments that yield results. In a sense, where the experiment says no to your hypothesis is a very big success because you know that's not the way to go. Yeah? So I know it's a nuance, but I wanted just to pick up on that. The final point is, okay, so I confess I am a former knowledge manager, so I did all the sins that you can possibly imagine. And my general feeling about it, so I think most of the things that I presented are not so much about knowledge sharing, but about horizon scanning, so about knowing what is happening outside in the world. Yeah? And it's being aware of what is happening around you and figuring out way to attract some of these examples to you rather than you having to constantly search for them, right? So it's a bit of a different thing, but to pick up on the knowledge sharing thing, I think the fundamental sin on most of the knowledge programs that I've seen is that they start from a very romantic, idealized view of what the knowledge worker is supposed to be, as if the first thing that when you start working on a project is you go into a lessons learned database of best practices, God forbid, and spend time looking at what has been done before you. And then as you work, you constantly document what you're doing, particularly your failures, because you love other people to write about their failures. And then at the end of a project, you spend all your life trying to put all of this into a project document, a report that nobody will ever read. And then people get very upset that this romantic view doesn't correspond with reality. So I think you're a much better way if you start from reality of how people really operate, which is you only need information when you need it. Right? Most people, in the case of need, and they come to you and they say, I want to know something, you hardly ever say no, right? And this is normal human behavior, but when you translate it into this romantic view of the world, somehow it doesn't work like that, right? So you start where people are and how they really actually behave, and then you design processes to allow them to do more of it. Yeah? So if your natural way of collecting information is not to go into a database, but actually to read newspapers, Google, do all sorts of other things, etc. How do we get you to do more of it? As opposed to try to tell you, really, you should put all of this on our intranet because this is the way where knowledge sharing goes. And I think that's a much different type of approach, and then you can design things in a very different way if you do it that way.
Thank you, Giulio, for a really inspiring talk. And a little bit of a continuation of what the last two questions were. Have you noticed any difference in terms of trying to shift from kind of linear problem solving to more systematic problem solving? In a big organization where they tend to, documents look like the UN, job application that's 20 years old, is it easier to make this shift and this switch in a smaller organization? I'd give you one example. I remember being 1994 in the Great Lakes during the big ethnic cleansing between the Hutu and the Tutsis there. And the UN brought in there were 500,000 refugees who crossed over the border into then Zaire from Rwanda. And people were just scattered all over a lava field, and there was no water, there were no supplies. So immediately they start trucking in water in these big, awful rubber black bladders, and that tastes putrid and everything. So the first priority was to get drinking water. So the UN came in with these huge, huge hydraulic drills. And all the little Rwandans, especially the elderly women and men, are going, all you need is a stick. We can find it. And they're whispering, because I'm out in the field there every day, and they see them, and they're boom, boom, breaking through this lava that, we were estimating the cost. And after 1 week of trying 3 or 4 different sites, then, they finally agreed to have the little old lady come with her divining stick, and sure enough, she found, the water. So, and this is an example of kind of like large organization thinking. It's hard to break through into their kind of mentality, and I think in a smaller organization, it'll happen a lot quicker. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas about how you can facilitate that process, because obviously people in this room are interested in change, but others find it very threatening.
Yeah. So I think. So I work on a number of issues like this, right? So at the moment I'm looking at business processes in a number of development organizations and see where do you find the entry point for some of these approaches, right? In very, very traditional type of hierarchies and all sorts of other things. I think two things fundamentally. One is if you try to change a system from the beginning, you're never going to go anywhere, right? I'm a big believer that you change by demonstration, right? So I think that smaller demonstration actually can at least prove that some things are possible rather than trying to change the system from the very beginning. You need to get to it, but eventually you need to actually prove to the naysayers that some things are possible and some things are not, right? Now, in my experience, it's not a matter of big or small organization, but it's actually a matter of a mentality of people close to the problem. And unfortunately, I find that regardless of the size, there is still very much this idea of we need to bring you something that you need. Because how can you, poor woman in Rwanda, know where is the water? I have a solution because I've come here, and frankly, my funding depending on giving you a solution, right? And so this is why I'm insisting that the first principle I banged on a lot is this question about mapping assets. I truly think that as a starting point, as a very small thing to do, is actually challenges profoundly all sorts of processes in development organization. And I think this is regardless how big or small you are. Because the question of going around and asking to these women where is the water is not really a matter of processes, of anything else, but it's a matter of attitude. And unfortunately, I find that this is very difficult to crack. The counterexample I always show is, IKEA. At a certain point, someone created this website called, I think, Hack IKEA, which was basically saying, is it really possible to all over the world? We're too close to IKEA. Yeah, exactly. Is it really possible that we all have the same furniture all over the world? Why don't we actually hack it and create personalized IKEA furniture, right? Now, what do you think is the first reaction of a big organizations to something like that? They want to shut it down, right? Legal department, etc., as opposed to saying, let's get more of this, which is eventually what they did, and now very successfully, right? It's that cultural barrier of actually saying people out there might have better expertise than we have inside. And to me, if you can crack that, at least through some demonstration activities, you can really demonstrate that things can work in a very, very different way. So, instead of having a centralized dashboard, right, you have decentralized data collection like the poor people, the poverty map that I showed you, right? You have a data-independent village as opposed to having a big dashboard centralized somewhere that someone can control. But that is really a very different mental attitude before anything else. If you can crack that, I think all the rest will follow.
Yeah, so it's a lot about attitudes, right? So on a related question, do you have any experience with senior management changing their attitudes when they listen to your talks or see some of the examples that you give?
Well, definitely not when they listen to me. Well, look, I have to say, for all that things that I said, I've actually been very blessed in development because I had many managers who supported the things that I was trying to do. However, I still think that this is not something that you win sitting in a place like this, right? I'm really, really think that the change in attitude happens experientially, right? And it's also an argument that you win rationally. Because sitting here, it's relatively easy to either dismiss this or say it's fantastic, but then do nothing about it, right? So I think the real issue is, can you actually make and show the change through projects? And to me, this is when you started seeing real change, right? So it's not so much that I expect people, when they see something like this, to change their behavior immediately, but I think if there is someone who wants to do this type of things, actually enable them to do it and do it quicker. Right? So, I often used to go around and say, look, this is what I want to do. I can promise you I don't have money. In fact, you'll work extra, and probably many of your colleagues will hate you because you'll be perceived to be the innovative one. You still want to work with me? Let's go ahead and do it. Right? And to me, it's the kind of people that you want to find at the beginning, the people who really want to do it. The other thing is, I find it really interesting by talking to many people who created innovation shops or activities in many different organizations. The first point where they start, many of them will tell you, I had a red line. I said, you know what? I think what we're doing now is criminal. No more of this. Right? It's quite consistent that you hear many people that say, you know what? At a certain point, I just said, enough of this. A project without talking to a single person on the field, criminal. I won't support this anymore. And this is where we start to change the system. And I think, to me, a big discriminant is to find the people who are actually willing to put that red line and say, you know what? Enough of this. I can control what I can control, but at least within what I can control, this is not going to happen anymore. Yep.
I mean, taking development from long time ago, the Robert Chambers, where they say, if you want to understand the community, go live with them, be part of them, do what they do. Was that not a direction for looking for innovation? But we missed something somewhere. So do you still, that theory still exists? Go live with them, be part of them. If they are not wearing shoes, you take off your shoes and wear their clothes traditionally, and all that, which, were development fallacies.
Yeah, so many of the things that I showed you are actually not new at all, right? Whether it's positive deviance, frugal innovation, Jugaad, all these type of things, like approaches that Chambers is advocating for, are certainly not new. The problem is they haven't become a norm, right? And so to me, this is a matter of asking why that is the case. I don't know if you've seen it, there's just a book that has come out on positive deviance that is actually making exactly this point, right? So positive deviance has been around for, what, decades? Yeah. And nobody, somehow, this has not made it to cash transfers, right? There's plenty of proofs that seem to point that this is actually the way to go, but still only 6%, better than me, right, is done of all aid is done through cash transfers, right? So it's these things that somehow we know, but don't make it across the system. And I think it's a very worthwhile question to know why this is the case. I do think that there's also new things that we can inject into this type of thinking, because now we have tools that allow to do these things more differently.
No more questions? So Giulio, let me say thank you very much for this. And we leave with the line of be interesting, go out and test, and challenge the system. Thank you very much.
Thank you.